Do the math. That means that we are going to have to figure out two of the words that go together. And two of the words that go together are the first two words on the list, spiritual and incarnational, because these have to do with our own spiritual formation. The last four words have to do with choices that we make as we turn outward, as we begin to engage the community. But before we turn outward, there is an interior work that needs to be done. So this morning we're going to drill down on these two words, spiritual and incarnation. Spiritual and incarnation. This is one of the books that I read while on sabbatical. And I read lots of books. Some of them were actually good. This was one of the best. When I came back from sabbatical, I told staff there were probably 3 books of the dozens and dozens that I read that I really thought that they too needed to read. And this is one of them. It's called The Sacrament of Evangelism, written by Jerry Root and Stan Guthrie. These are two guys who teach evangelism at a college up in Chicago. Have devoted their lives to trying to understand evangelism, have worked all kinds of evangelism programs and activities, and finally concluded that so much of what they've been trying to do was wrong-headed and wrong-hearted. Because what they were trying to do was to recruit people to do something, to do a program, to learn some skills, and then to go out in a programmatic sort of way and fulfill that. And they said finally they began to look more carefully at Scripture and realized, and it's kind of a stunning fact, that nowhere in the New Testament does anybody ever tell anybody to go evangelize. Nowhere does in the book of Acts do we find the Apostle Paul or the Apostle Peter standing up before a group of believers saying, you need to evangelize. How come you're not evangelizing? How come you're not sharing your faith? They discovered pretty quickly that it was just happening, spontaneously, authentically. It was overflowing naturally from a deep center. And so they concluded that rather than trying to teach a skill set or to plan and program some new evangelistic endeavor, that maybe the assignment was for people to get better acquainted with God. That if we get better acquainted with the God who is there, the God that we know in Jesus Christ, begin to have a relationship with that God at a deeper point, we're going to start acting like that God. We're going to start giving ourselves to the things that matter to that God. And what they discovered pretty quickly in their studies and in this book is that evangelism is really just a sacrament. Definition of a sacrament: an outward and visible sign of an inward and invisible grace. The inward and invisible part of evangelism is our relationship with God. It's our relationship with the God who is there, the God that we know in Jesus Christ. As we get acquainted with this God, as we spend time with this God, we will begin to embrace the things that matter to Him. We will begin to reflect the things that He's about. And what Root and Guthrie make abundantly clear is that the God we bump into in Scripture is a God of mission. Without exception. It's the God who is always going after people, always pursuing people, always trying to get back what belongs to Him. And so Guthrie and Root in their book make a big to-do about a big word theologically, omnipresence. It's one of those words that we sing at Christmas time during Handel's Messiah. Okay? Omnipresent means the God who is everywhere present. The scripture that bears witness to this truth most eloquently is Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like day and the darkness is as light to you. Incredible description of the God who is there. And what this means is you can't go anywhere where God is not already present. You can't go anywhere where God is not already active. You can't go anywhere. In a sense, we have to disabuse ourselves of this evangelistic notion that says, if these folks are going to know anything about God, I've got to bring it. Because it's not there, I got it, I'm going to come and I'm going to give it to you. Instead, this view of evangelism says God is already there. God is already active. God is already committed to the well-being, the spiritual well-being of these people, and our assignment is simply to kind of tap them on the shoulder or nudge them in the side and say, do you see it? Do you see where God is? Do you see what God is doing? De Caloris, I'm looking for my Emmaus people. De Caloris, come on, say it back. De Caloris. De Caloris. One of the grace talks at the Walk to Emmaus is about the second word that they emphasize. It's the doctrine or the notion of prevenient grace. I was trained at a disciples' seminary. I had read a lot of theology, and it wasn't until I walked to Emmaus that I learned about prevenient grace. And for me, it's one of the most precious truths that I now know. Prevenient grace moves from omnipresence, the God who is there, to an understanding of what is it that God is doing there. Prevenient is a combination of two Latin words, the prefix pre and the verb vene. It means the God who comes before. God is always previous. Here's how a Wesleyan theologian, a really fine Wesleyan theologian, Tim Tennant, he's the president of Asbury Seminary up in Kentucky. Tim says, prevenient grace is a collective term for the ways in which God's grace comes into our lives prior to conversion. Prevenient grace literally means the grace that comes before. I love the fact that Methodists believe that even if you go to the ends of the earth with the gospel, you will always find that God precedes you and in effect beats you there. Perhaps prevenient grace is summed up best by the famous interruption of a missionary who was lecturing in Africa about how their missionaries, the Methodist missionaries, brought the gospel to Africa. The African believer interrupted and said, the missionaries didn't bring God the gospel to Africa. God brought the missionaries to Africa. God was already there. God was already involved. God was already active, and the assignment was simply an assignment of figuring out where God was and what God was doing and cooperating with it. We have a term for this that we've used right here at Northway. We call this God science. God science. In the second handout you got, there's a wonderful article by a Mennonite, the leader of the Mennonite Church in the United States of America. And he talks about how he has a friend who teaches at the seminary, the Mennonite Seminary up in Chicago, who is a hunter. And he talks about how when you go hunting, the way that you hunt is you track the animal. You look for signs of where the animal has been and where the animal is headed, and then you follow it. And he says that this is perhaps the most important spiritual discipline that a church like ours can learn. A church like ours that wants to be more missionally engaged, more missionally involved, says the first step that we need to actively embrace is tracking God. Is getting a sense of where is it that God is going, and to get on God's trail, to follow after God, to learn to track with God. And so on this second sheet on the back part where there's that wonderful essay by Mennonite, there are some spiritual exercises, and we're going to give ourselves to those for the next 10 minutes. There are 3 questions that you are going to be asked to consider. First of all, let's just define what a God sighting is. A God sighting is someplace you have seen God recently. Mostly they don't involve heavenly trumpets, or flashes of light, or hairy prophets shouting, "Thus saith the Lord." But God's love, or God's healing, or God's peace, or God's joy is present in some unexpected and especially powerful way. So I'm going to ask you to take just a few minutes and to do 3 things. I want you to think about 3 questions. We're going to get this done fairly quickly because I also want you to take a few moments to share a table. The 3 questions I want you to think about. One is a rather global question about when and where in your life have you seen this? When and where in your life have you had a sense of God's presence, a sense of God acting mercifully, bestowing the gifts of peace or grace upon you, a sense of God's companionship when you weren't expecting it. The first question that I want you to think about is how does this happen in your life? So now you go all the way back to your beginning and just think about, where are those places where I've seen God's footprints on the floor? Where have I seen and felt God's companionship? Where has God been previous in my life and I was awakened to it at one point? That's the first thing I want you to do. Then I want you to up the ante, okay? And I don't want you to think in terms of my whole life. I want you to think about this past week. Just this past week, from last Sunday morning to this Sunday morning. And I want you to do the same thing for the last week. I want you to ask yourself, where have I seen God at work this past week in my life? Where have I seen God at work this week in my church? And third, where have I seen God at work this week in the world? So the first one is a whole life kind of review. When and where have you seen God in a surprising sort of way, an unexpected sort of way, a convenient sort of way? And write that down. And then narrow your focus to just this week. Where has God been this week? In your life, in the life of this church, and in the world. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, not quite 10 minutes, to do that. And then we're going to wrap up with some sharing.